Welcome and thank you for coming today. We have about 50% Eberhard era alumni and 50% current faculty and staff. There are a few of you who overlap. So when I ask for Eberhard era alumni and you overlap, please join the Eberhard alumni group for now. It has to do with who gets to the food first. And you may be disappointed in what that really means. Let me just start by saying thanks to you all for coming. I'm Bob Shibley. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning, and it's my absolute honor to welcome our guest of honor today, John Paul Eberhard. John has come with his wife and 2 children. They apparently drove him up. He drove him up, right? And they'll be joining us, of course, this evening and for some events tomorrow. This is an opportunity for the alumni from the Eberhard era and John himself to get to know the faculty and staff of today. We have, I think, all the earmarks of a legacy program here. And you can see its roots going all the way back to John and his leadership in startup. And you can feel the energy and power that is ours, but has a lovely kind of, at least metaphorical alignment with where John and this Eberhard era crew started this. So it should be a good dialogue about our school's history. And I think there will be some nostalgia. But I'm also eager to have us have this conversation in present tense. Where are we going and how are we building on the strength of this legacy? And I think that's one of the things that excites the faculty as well. We are our history, but we're not trapped by it. We are building on it, and that's a large part of this. In many ways, what we have here is a school of architecture and planning that started as a school of architecture, of environmental design. Was in John's own words, a pretty radical critique of the profession of architecture, an effort to rethink. And if ever there was a cadre of new people ready to rethink, they're here with you today, and I'm excited about that as well. What's interesting to me is John, who engineered a revolution in teaching and thinking of architecture and planning in the formation of our school over 40 years ago. He continued this drive. He never stopped innovating. He never stopped adding value. You'll hear more about his history this evening, but it's an extraordinary adventure in creative thinking. Most recently, this is occurring in his research on the link between architecture and neuroscience. John, we're honored to have you here today in celebration of a lifetime of achievements. We are also honored to be joined today by several of the pioneering founding faculty and first students who joined in this experiment. I think many of whom have traveled some distance. Michael Holtz might get the prize for the furthest from Colorado in today. Is that right, Michael? Yeah. Anybody further away than Colorado? You win. See Barbara for the check. We're going to invite you all to go to the buffet table, but in 2 phases. I'm going to ask all the Eberhard era people to join us here for some photographs that we can get you all back. So unlike the photographs of when you were here before, where you won't recognize yourselves, this time you'll have a chance to do that. So I'm going to pull the Eberhard alumni this way, and everybody else go get a bite to eat. We'll have a chance, I think, at the tables where you're divided roughly 50-50 to talk about the present tense and the past tense together, maybe in some cases in the same sentence, and get to know each other a little bit. And then after the food, we'll come back here for a bit more of a conversation. I'll ask my chairs, Ernest Sternberg, Professor Sternberg, and Professor Omar Khan in architecture, planning and architecture, to join me with John. And we'll have that kind of, John, tell us what you thought you were really trying to do, as opposed to how we've romanticized it over the last 40 years. And then perhaps some of the Eberhard era folks will give us a kind of filling in the holes and gaps, because none of us remember as well as we used to. And then I think our faculty will have some questions and challenges, and also maybe an opportunity to offer some of our current directions. So that's the program. It's not formal. It's meant for us just to have a really good conversation, both around the meal and a little later in seminar format. As an extra treat, for those of you who are into treats like this, we just had an accreditation of our architecture program, and that exhibit is up in one of the facilities we're in Surge Space right now as we're renovating Hayes Hall. So we'd love to take a little walk down maybe a couple blocks and give you an opportunity to see some of the contemporary work by our students. Those of you who are Eberhard era, raise your hands, please. Look around. And could I ask the rest of us to applaud them for their time? The rest of us go eat. Eberhard era, stay here for some photographs. Thank you. So just to restate, John, thank you again for joining us and allowing us this opportunity to honor you and your legacy at the school. We're only just beginning. There'll be an obnoxiously long resume read tonight, and we'll work through that. But we're not going to spend a lot of time with that because most of us here are friends and colleagues, either from long ago or from now. We are very honored that our alumni base is back after many years, and many of you have been in and out of the school off and on for decades, and we thank you for that continuing engagement. And those of you we haven't seen for a very long time, we hope we see you again really soon, and we'll be working on it. The school is in the act of building. We are building curriculum, we are building research capacity, and we are building our facilities. Examples of all of that are behind me. First in the kind of images of the life of the school that are portrayed on the 250-inch monitors, and then maybe it's worth a little time. And you guys can watch that as these guys ramble on. We'll do that fine. We're also in Hayes and Crosby Hall in the midst of a $50 million renovation. And it's a challenging effort for us. We have a relatively modest school in the scheme of things at the University of Buffalo. We have 800 students, there's 27,000 students here. So you get a sense of the ratio. For the university to make an investment of over $50 million in this project has been extraordinary for us, and it's a vote of confidence in our direction going forward. We've got a lift to make sure that we furnish and equip it in a way consistent with a modern and contemporary school of architecture. And I think we're a long way from the bar on Bailey Avenue, and I know we're a long way from the fit out of the meter building. I'm painfully aware that we can do really good work almost anywhere, but we imagine place matters. So we're going to be working a lot and hard to try and raise the funds to outfit this building and carry that forward. We are, in the world of building curriculum, establishing a new PhD program and a new Master of Science in Architecture, both designed to bring a broader range of disciplines and depth to architecture and planning at the school. Those are important new initiatives. They're just starting this year. We'll be admitting our first PhDs. We hope to be admitting some of our first Master of Science students in a kind of newly framed program. And again, the idea of interdisciplinarity is at the base of all this. So that's just by way of a kind of reference point. For those of you who haven't been here for a while, our programs are somewhat different than what you might remember. Some of you have the old 5-year bachelor's degree. We have a 6-year program in architecture, 4 years in the Bachelor of Science in Architecture, 2 at the master's level. And on the planning side, we have a 4-year Bachelor's of Environmental Design, fashioned in some ways after the ones that were originated here, and then a 2-year Master of Urban and Regional Planning. The PhD is formally vested in planning, but owns and runs across the school. The Master of Science in Architecture, formally vested in architecture, but open across the disciplines. So you can begin to see how we're starting to create the mixed environment that we think the discipline of architecture, planning, or world making requires. And that's the real foundation for it. So that's just by way of orientation. New building, new life in the school, new research capacity. We acquired this year something that was about as big as Boston. In the best years of the Buffalo Organization for Social and Technical Innovation, they were making about as much money as this new acquisition. So we see ourselves reinvested in both immediate local service, in the kind of research and service contracting that we do with our colleagues often in the profession. And then concurrently, that same center is one that attracts federal money from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We expect over time from the National Science Foundation and other sources. So we are entering a kind of an additional layer, not a different, but an additional layer of sponsored research and substantial depth in our programs. Both our chairs will speak to that. I think perhaps one of the most important things to acknowledge here is that we have a very edgy and creative faculty. They're fantastic. They bring to their disciplines a kind of aggressiveness. There's a kind of radical bent and edge to it. It's an edge that when I read the history from our time 40 some odd years ago, I think I felt you could certainly read it in some of the early written words and journal materials that were published by Progressive Architecture and other magazines at the time about where we started. So the two chairs, Professor Sternberg and Professor Khan, will have an opportunity later to talk to that. John, off the top, because I've not asked you to prepare, and I say that to everyone. This is ad lib and fair enough to prepare for anything for this lunch. But I am thinking it would be useful to ask you to do maybe about one thing. Chat some with all of us about the origins of the school. And for those of you who were part of that origin, ask him questions, challenge him, remind him. Or, wait a minute, I thought we were doing something else. That was all fair. Let's have a conversation, John and the Eberhard era people. I want to ask, in addition, to invite our team from today to float in and also ask questions, clarify what those roots in history are. At the risk of it becoming too nostalgic, if there's time after this exchange, I'm going to ask both Ernie and Omar to tell us what we're up to in more detail today. And maybe by reference to what they see or by contrast to what they see. The point isn't that it's different or it's the same. The point is legacy work requires contemporary adjustments and challenges all the time. And what we see happening is a good, rich dialogue about who we have been, who we are today, and who we might become. And I think a lot of us are starting to wonder, given the state of the world, who we might become and how we think about it. So with that, I'm going to ask John, I'll give you the mic, and then we'll probably give up on the mic soon, and you can either stand or sit, whichever is most comfortable.
I'll stand up initially. Is this my notes?
Feel free, I can.
Well, unaccustomed as I am to public speaking. Let me tell you about how this school really got started. The first thing that happened was the Republicans elected Richard Nixon as president. And I had been in the government working at the National Bureau of Standards in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. And I said, if Nixon is going to be president, I'm not going to be part of the government. So I resigned from the National Bureau of Standards. And earlier in that year, I had been out to visit the School of Architecture at the state, or 2 years before that, at the University of California at Berkeley. And Martin Meyerson was the dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at Berkeley. And when I toured his school, he had been that week made the acting chancellor of the university because the chancellor was sick or something. And anyway, I only had a few minutes with him at the end of the day. I said, Martin, I'm really disappointed. He said, why? I said, I didn't see anything very interesting going on in your school. And he said, well, I'm sorry about that because I had planned on Kathleen Worcester being the one who would be stimulating new ideas for our School of Architecture and Planning, but she had died. So now we fast forward 2 years, and I'm leading the National Bureau of Standards, and I get a phone call from this person named Martin Myerson. And he said, all right, smart aleck. He said, you didn't like what you saw in California, but I've got a lot of money because Nelson Rockefeller has given us a lot of money, who's then the governor of New York. And we don't have a School of Architecture at the State University of New York at Buffalo. So why don't you come and start one that you think would be appropriate to your purposes, but to our purposes. So that's how I happened to get the phone call. And I came up for a visit. And Martin introduced me to the 3 provosts, as they were known in those days, with whom I was supposed to interact. Warren Bennis, who was the provost of Humanities and Social Sciences, Carl Willenbrock, who was the provost of Engineering, and Eric Larrabee, who was the provost of Arts and Letters. I think that's the right title. And he said that we had a conversation, and they said, what do you think you would do at the School of Architecture? And I said, well, we don't have a PhD program, but it should be interdisciplinary. And they said, yeah, we agree with that. That's why we want the School of Architecture to be located in 3 faculties, our 3 faculties, they were provosts of. So that was the beginning of establishment of the concept of the school. And then the next problem was, well, what kind of faculty were we going to get? And I had this character working for me at the National Bureau of Standards, whose name was Michael Brill. And Michael had come to work for me at the National Bureau of Standards because we had a special project that nobody who was on the faculty or the staff at the National Bureau of Standards was able to handle. And I had met Michael, I don't know where, and he said, why would you want to hire a fag boutique architect? And I said, well, because you're smart. He said, well, what kind of title are you going to give me? And I said, well, why don't you decide what you would like to have be your title? So any of you who know Michael will not be surprised to know that the next day he came in with 3 full sheets of foolscap with various names on it. And I said, well, pick out one of them. And he said, honcho. So he said, I want to be the chief honcho of the new school. So that's what he became. And then we managed to find Jerry Collison and George Borowski, who came to join us, and we decided to form this organization called BOSTI, Buffalo Organization for Social and Technological Innovation. Because when I had been at the National Bureau of Standards, the man I worked with and got to admire very greatly was Don Schoen, who was then the director of the Institute for Applied Technology, and I was his deputy. And we lived a couple of blocks from each other in Washington. And every morning, either one of us would pick up the other, and we would drive together to our offices at the National Bureau of Standards. And we decided that that was an important way to communicate, because we didn't have time during the day when we were busy to talk to each other. But if we talked to each other on the way in and then on the way home, we would have an opportunity to share ideas. When he left in 1966, he went to Boston and he formed a research organization called OST, the Organization for Social and Technological Innovation. And I became the director of the Institute for Applied Technology. And while Johnson was still president, I had the distinct pleasure of being invited to the Rose Garden to shake his hand because I got promoted to be the highest ranking architect in the government at that point. Not because I was an architect, but because I was managing the School of Architecture in New York. the time. And when I got the call from Martin and decided to come here and to form this research group, I asked John Schoen if we could affiliate with Boston, and he said yes. So that's how we formed Boston, to build on the relationship with Boston. So one other thing that I forgot to put in my speech, so I'm going to put it in now for those of you who are here. I forgot to mention a very important innovation that we also introduced my first year I was here. That was the result of a group of young men who graduated mostly from Erie County. Erie County, is that the name of it? Yeah. The two-year Erie Technical School, two-year degree in architecture that they offered there, and we were working in architectural firms. And it came to me and said, we'd like to be able to get an architecture degree from the university. I said, well, that'd be an awful lot of work. Are we prepared to work that hard? And they said, well, what do you mean, how hard? I said, well, we found out to go to school 3 nights a week. I said, well, we'll do it. And they did it. And we created the architecture program at Miller Fillmore School, and some of our graduate students, faculty, and some of the faculty who later came were also part of the Miller Fillmore program at school. And then we, and I don't remember the sequence here, but at some point we decided we needed an undergraduate program. And by some stroke of good fortune, I don't remember exactly how it happened, but some of you did, Emi Jamal appeared. And we retained him to come and start the program in environmental design, which went on for years, and some people here were also graduates of. So that's how the 3 pieces got started about. That's probably enough to, I ran out of script with it.
So John, before you stop, talk a little bit about the philosophy, because that was really the heart and soul, trying to accomplish that was counter to the current programs in architecture. That was really what drew me here, and that drew most of me here. What you just said is really what it's all about.
Well, since you already started,
Well, I could. You should at least file questions and say, what do you have in mind?
yeah.
Because this really takes back to some of your famous quotes at the site about the point of the
Yeah, that's right. You're taxing my memory.
about how organized.
Oh, well, you don't get organized to go to the moon by sitting down and making drawings on a piece of paper, obviously. You have to bring together a team of people from various disciplines who can contribute to the problem solving that's necessary. And you don't reach the moon except by accident without having a measurement system that we developed at the National Bureau of Standards telling you. So we can measure time instead of only 12 decimal points, we could measure time at 14 decimal points. And that kept physicists busy. But we eventually were able to create here a program in which we brought people from all kinds of disciplines, not just undergraduate degrees in architecture, but people who came from journalism, people who came from public administration, people who came from civil engineering, people who came from, what are some of the other, planning, English major, aerospace engineer, right? Undertaker. Yes, right. Yeah, that's right. Systems design was the was the key concept. We didn't have computers yet, interestingly enough. If we had, we would have probably had an entirely more sophisticated program than we had as it was. But the systems design was the key, and being able to describe in the initial stages of systems design what are the programmatic requirements, and then how would you evaluate whether or not those requirements can be met. And then when you develop a solution, to be able to test it in the abstract against those design criteria before you implement it was one of the big lessons that I think we all learned. In Boston, we did 100 research projects in the 4 years I was here, and we were paid for every one of them. We're going to talk about one of them this afternoon, the remarks that I make at the graduation. But we had projects that ranged from developing actually a building system for SUNY, right? For the SUNY architecture system, North Campus, right? Do you remember any of the other projects? Yeah.
Is the North Campus your fault?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. We talked about where it's located. We did have quite a debate with the powers that be about where it should be. And Bob Coles, who I think was on the faculty at that point, was really adamant about the fact that we should have this new campus located down on the waterfront in downtown Buffalo instead of out in Amherst.
Might be useful follow-up to that. I'll come in. Is when it comes to this event, I went down to my library and just tried to write down the names and authors of a few of the books that we kind of kicked around and during graduate program, undergraduate architecture. We didn't want to do traditional architecture. In any case, some of the books, here's a few, see if you remember famous ones. John was famous for that became famous. Structural scientific revolutions, that was the Bible for Redesigning the Future, Wes Acock, Subversive Science, Paul Shepard, and The Age of Discontinuity, Peter Drucker, General System Theory by Ludwig van Beethoven. Biological Order, Andre Locke, Beyond the Stable State by Don, Future of the Future, John Hale. Anyhow, those are some of the books that but it's all related to systems theory, trying to systematize this, which is most totally arbitrary architectural efforts. And it's still the case today. I mean, it's actually almost worse still. But what people actually put performance objectives and evaluation criteria, you have to test those solutions against those criteria. And that's really is disappointing to me because to me, design equals performance. And most architects, design equals design. It's like ridiculous. For example, we all know Daniel Industries, right? And he was designing to Andrew Hartley. And the technique he used was to have a large piece of foam. So, maybe 3 foot by 3 foot cube. And he would come into the local architect, who was going to be the architect of record, with a chainsaw. And then he would start slicing and dicing this piece of foam until it looked cool. And that's how the museum ended up. And if you've been in the museum and try to look at how these gallery spaces are supposed to showcase published, and that's where architecture, I think, is a terrible thing because it's irrelevant. It's stupid. It's ugly.
So you can see what happened when you went to the school that I started. Ended up being iconoclast.
I think I went even crazier. Turns out I have hard of hearing. And I was hard of hearing back then, so I've always looked at things wrong. And the degree I got was a Master of Arts in Building System Design. But my understanding of what that was that it was not about designing buildings at all. It was about designing the system by which buildings get put up. And so instead of 2x4s and concrete pillars, it was much more about institutions and rules and new technologies. And so I saw the program as pretty much independent buildings and never picked up the T-square, and instead became very much involved in changing regulations and changing the process of building, change contracts of building to put up. And that was my understanding. It was not to create a new school of architecture. There are plenty of schools of architecture that are all fine and good, but to create something really dramatically different.
There was a resource question. There was a resource question.
I just wanted to add one piece of information, the initial program that I was thinking about, which I still use.
There's one thing that I took away from the initial program years that impacted on me personally and in my professional practice that has not been mentioned, and I think it's a very important piece of the sensitization and the change, because I was already an architect when I came to the school, and that whole thing about user needs was so fundamentally different from the way architects were looking at things. And I think everybody, at least I tried when I was teaching, to impact in that direction, because if you're going to do a building, you've got to be concerned about who's going to use it. And frankly, nobody was, or very few people were, except in very specialty kinds of situations. But to kind of make that a bottom line or a predicate of design was one of the things that I think was extremely unique and very important, because I had spent a lot of time at Cornell, and I tell you, that word never was mentioned. And I know it wasn't mentioned very much in other schools, but it certainly was a core issue with us. So I just wanted to add that to the mix.
That the precursor to the health issue of performance.
Right, but I still
Well, I think Ed's work that he's done with user requirements and people who are handicapped was a good sequence to what we had started, and I hope what we provided was some inspiration for your follow-up over the last 30, 40 years now, right?
Want me to say a few things about it?
Huh?
Want me to say
Sure.
I don't know most of you folks here, but I was never in the same place at the same time as John, but when I was a graduate student at University of Michigan, I was in a course where they brought in the leading lights in advanced thinking in architecture, and John was one of the people that came, and I was able to spend a day with him in a seminar and take him to the airport even, I think. And that really influenced a lot of the work that I did, because I was studying gerontology in architecture, and later I followed a lot of people to the National Bureau of Standards, and I worked at the Center for Building Technology, but not for very long, because I really didn't like working for the government. And at that time I got introduced to the idea of design standards for accessibility, and realized that there wasn't an evidence base for the standards that were in effect. So I I was actually appointed to a committee, federal committee, where they had representatives from different departments of government, and the request came, from this committee: who should you appoint? Please appoint someone. And it started at the Department of Commerce's secretary level, and it worked its all the way down to the architectural research section. And my boss looked at all the CVs and said, "Who wants to do this?" "Nobody wants to do this. It's Steinfeld. You do it." So, because you're the closest. And I said, "Okay." And that's how I got started on working on standards. But I think it was if I hadn't known of the work that John and his associates were doing, I don't think I would have been as interested in that as I was. And eventually that became the beginning of my career, my research career, once I left the Bureau of Standards and was able. I actually made an unsolicited proposal to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to write standards, to do a research study that would lead to better standards. And they jumped on that, had a competition. I won the competition for it, and then that's how I got started in doing research in this field.
What you're speaking to is a bigger issue on I think we call it the performance concept. But if you remember back in those days, that building requirements were all very prescriptive and very narrowly defined. So it made it really difficult for any type of significant advances or innovation in design and architecture and construction. And so that was kind of a springboard for a whole lot of things, including that study that Tom and I worked on is performance-based building regulations funded by the National Science Foundation. That went on for several years, even further at the AIARC, which continued to connect up with. And I think that has really, I think one thing that's been a significant paradigm shift. That's it. It's going away from prescriptive requirements to performance-based requirements, which are only can occur if you have the ability to actively evaluate. That's the key. You have to have some criteria that then you can have some basis to determine if the criteria have been met or not. So if you've been thinking about the advancements of computers and all the other things that have happened over the years, the most single greatest thing that's happened is the ability to assess performance in very sophisticated ways. And when I meet with designers and others, I say, you are so fortunate because you can fail gracefully. That is, during design, you can screw up constantly and regularly, which is a good thing because it's in design as opposed to a physical entity that's failing. And you can then test alternatives until you get the one that's going to work best and deliver the performance that you're attempting to do in your design. So that performance concept is another key thing, I think, in this field.
Well, we won't get a chance to talk about it this afternoon, but I think maybe this would be a good forum in which to bring it up. My favorite topic of today. And how did I get into that? And that's neuroscience, the science of the brain. And the way I got into it partially was because I was an architect. And I was working at the American Institute of Architects. And Norman Kuntz, who was the head of the Architectural Foundation and who was my boss, said, we want to work on how do we understand the way that spaces respond to human requirements, and what are some good examples that we can come up with. And he had been listening to the radio that afternoon, as a matter of fact, and he said, I heard on the radio that there's a guy named Gage, Dr. Gage, at the Salk Institute in California, who has been experimenting with mice in which he provided them with an enriched environment, meaning that they had cages to ride around in. And that what he found out was in an enriched environment that they had increased neurons that developed in their brains. He said, we got to go out and talk to him because maybe he can help us understand how enriched environments by architects would help people's brains become better adjusted to the kind of spaces they're in. So we went out to see Fred Gage, and he's now a great friend, but he said to us then, you architects, he said, I didn't say anything about buildings. I said I had rats that ran around in cages that were improved, and that their brains improved. I didn't say anything about people running around in cages and getting their brains improved. He said, but let's go over to the Neuroscience Institute and see the architecture of what's going on over there. And this was a new building that had been built in La Jolla that had been designed by... Right. And that the man who was the head of the Institute, Neuroscience Institute, Edelman, Dr. Edelman, invited us to come into his office and talk about his new building. And I knew that he was working on neuroscience, obviously. And I said, could you tell us something, Dr. Edelman, about how neuroscience affects architecture? And he didn't answer me, he just kept on talking. After a while, I raised the question again. I said, Dr. Edelman, could you tell me something about how neuroscience is related to architecture? And he didn't answer me. And he did all the talking about it. And I found out later that he essentially said to himself, why should I spend my time trying to explain to architects who don't know anything about neuroscience what neuroscience has to do with architecture? He said they wouldn't understand what I was talking about. But he gave us his book. And his book was a book that he had written about how he became a neuroscientist and what he thought neuroscience was all about. And I read it on an airplane going home, and I couldn't understand more than half of the words in the book, but I found it intriguing. And what I compared it to was Thomas Jefferson. You were talking about Thomas Jefferson's expedition, as he called it, in which he said, we need to find out whether there's a way to get on the water across the Northwest to the Pacific Ocean. And they had Lewis and Clark take on this expedition. And as they started down the path, the first thing that they came up to, they had no idea, no one knew, that there was this gigantic formation in the earth called the... What? No, the mountains. Rocky Mountains. And he said, and they said, well, we really have to figure out how to chart these mountains in order to figure out how we're going to get to the West Coast. So I said to Norman Clements, boy, we've come up against the Rocky Mountains here in the knowledge field when we find out that there's this work going on in brain science, and we didn't even know it was there. I said, well, what we've got to work on is how we're going to find our way through the brain sciences to where we understand better what the fundamental user needs are. And those user needs are based on how children in classrooms, brains are affected by the kinds of spaces that they're being educated in, how patients in hospitals are affected in terms of their improvement in their health by the kinds of spaces in which they're located, by which people who are working in offices, efficiency and ability to work are affected by the kind of spaces they're working in. So for 15 years now, I've been working on how those questions, and how does neuroscience and the science of the brain help us understand the answers to those questions. And we're just scratching the surface. But it's, if you'll believe me, at this junction, maybe you will, it's going to have more impact on architecture than computers have. And when we were here 40 years ago, we didn't have computers yet. But you all know that computers now, I don't assume you graduate anybody who didn't know how to use a computer. You won't graduate anybody 20 years from now that doesn't know how the brain works.
That's a good segue to our research groups.
Thank you. Maybe I can just talk a little bit about where the department is now. I actually do agree with you in terms of the significance of the brain sciences. For us, in the department, over the last 6 years, we've actually moved towards thinking about research as a way to reinvigorate practice. So not research only as a means to become part of a research university, which has its own merits and interdisciplinarity, but actually a really concerted effort to rethink design and practice and architectural relevance. Right now we have 4 research groups that are working, that offer 3 courses, an intellectual domains course, a materials techniques course, as well as a studio. And so we believe in the studio environment, which is, I think, the only educational environment, in my opinion, where what exactly you're talking about, you can get a number of expertise around the problem and work towards it. So the 4 groups are inclusive design, which is Ed's group, and I think has now moved into beyond standards, beginning to start thinking about the true effect of human factors in the design of spaces. Another group is the ecological practices. We know that climate crisis is not only real, but something that perhaps we can't even address completely at this stage. And so I think the question of, and what I think is very interesting right now is perhaps at your time, a lot of these problems seem to be problems that could be addressed. In our time, I think these are problems that have to be managed more than solved. And the ecological practices group is looking at ways of thinking about sustainable architecture beyond just the simple terms of building efficiencies and performance. And performance is a big part of that. Another group is the material cultures group, which I think is a significant part of what architecture is, which is part of the material sciences and the material product in the built environment. And so we have a very strong sense that materiality and the use of material assemblies have a critical role to play. This is not just an aesthetic goal, it's a goal that has strong ties to what I think is in some ways the essential nature of architecture, and how architecture influences history as well as people's perception of what they may want to be and do. And then finally there's the group, which is the Situated Technologies group, that looks really at the information environment, which influences just about everything we do now. It's not just the computer, it is computing, which is now embedded everywhere and in the ether, in the air. And how do we tackle that, or begin to understand that as a way to design more responsive architecture in the built environment? So I think the challenges are really interesting, maybe similar challenges. One thing I would sort of distinguish in terms of the challenge is that what seem to have been tools perhaps in your time are now the environment. The information, computing is not a tool anymore, it's an environment. It's an environment that has its own ecology, that sort of functions sometimes outside our own agency. The climate is not something other, it's us. We are the climate. And that relationship between the climate is no longer something we can control. And thank goodness for that. That realization is important, and how that changes how we may act in that world. And I think the third big issue that's confronting us is the public, being a part of a public university. And we've seen the public rise this past year violently in Libya and Greece, peacefully in Egypt. But you can see that the public has a lot to say about the built environment and wants more representation. So that's a very interesting emerging area, and how does architecture respond to that, since it has always responded to power in general. So we see research alive and well in architecture. We we see it also as instrumental in the way we're thinking about architecture. So I think that's a strong legacy that you can be glad to see is alive and well.
There's an interesting dynamic that's parallel to, I think, the experience you constructed, although it grew up somewhat independently, which is these research groups are self-selected affinity groups across the faculty, and the students matriculate through each of these groups at the graduate level. So you have faculty-student teams solving problems together, rather than faculty teaching students or students driving faculty. It's the problem driving both, or it's all of the students matriculate through one of the research groups. There's always a few of them, like perhaps you and me when we were younger, that actually still try and move across them all the time. But for the most part, they come to graduate school with a very solid 4-year base. And we get most of our accrediting taken care of in that first 4 years of basic education. So we can treat that graduate program to pursue some of the performative issues, systemic issues, the kind of understanding that I just framed. The other thing that we're very excited about is that's an undergraduate base of sorts. We have an environmental design program I'm ask Ernie to talk about, which has its roots in Hebe Jamal and goes from there. And then you'll take us all the way up to the PhD program. Maybe Selena can talk some about that.
Oh, absolutely. Great.
Thank you very much. This was a fascinating introduction. I've been here for 22 years. I didn't know 99% of this story. This is wonderful. And also throws a lot of light on what things were about when I got here, a lot of what I didn't understand. Hebe Jamal was here, and Magda McHale was here. And they had a perception of the world that I think I didn't sufficiently understand. And you threw a lot of light, all of you have thrown a lot of light on what was then. It's too bad I didn't get some of this history then. It's very interesting that, of course, I'd heard of John McHale's book, The Future of the Future. I think what you've been telling us here is the history of the future, sort of. Okay. And the question then is how we've gotten to where we have gotten now since then. We just discovered from President Obama that he has evolved. We have evolved too. We have evolved a great deal. We've been evolving for longer than we've ever heard of President Obama. And where we are now, we have an undergraduate program called Environmental Design. And what has sustained from what you left, it has changed a great deal. It's only a junior and senior program at this point, though we do admit students sooner. Is a open, multidisciplinary, I would say liberal arts introduction to the design fields. So students can explore and learn in part through the studio setting so they can decide which professional field they want to enter into upon graduation. So then thereupon they may decide to go into architecture or urban planning or environmental science or landscape field, and many of them do come to us. That program certainly wouldn't exist without your influence. At the graduate level, we have the Master of Urban Planning. But let's talk about evolution for a second. And once again, the way it has evolved, we probably have 4 major concentrations in this field. We have an excellent and interesting field, partly around the work of Selena Rajak, from whom you'll hear in a second, on the role of environment in public health, such as in exercise and obesity and so forth. Perhaps a subject we didn't think about then, but reflecting contemporary worries and contemporary thinking. We have a very strong field of research and interest in the subject of disaster. And this emerges, and not just in the urban planning field, ever since 9/11 and Katrina. And I'm very glad to say that we have a strong presence in that field. And we can teach students some things that many other programs cannot teach. We also have the fruit of our collaboration, one of our many fruits of our collaboration next to architecture is we have a wonderful set of people working in environment and urban design issues, often very closely with each other and closely with architecture. Like David, I went to Cornell. I can say as a result of my coming to Cornell, having graduated from Cornell, I came here with an urban planning degree, knowing nothing about architecture. And David knows how that can happen, right? Yes, and so can anyone else who went there. I've had this school, this university, has been my education in design and in architecture. It's been 22 years of wonderful learning, and learning to me has opened my eyes and I think made me a more creative and more open-ended person. I won't say much more. I'm going to turn it over to Samina to talk about the PhD program, but I'll say this much about your legacy, which is that our program in our school has always been open to its own evolution, which is a systems concept in itself. And it has been, throughout my time here, it has never been a dogmatic school. We don't have a dogma. And that's why we can let so many different ideas flower. So I think we owe a lot of that to you. With that, let me share a bit about the PhD programs, and I'll turn it over to Samina.
Thank you. I just want to thank all of you for being here. Like Ernie, I did not know any of this history. I've been here at UB for 10 years. And it has changed, including by the fact that there are more women in the room, which I think you'll agree is a good thing. I'm really delighted to hear about this history about neuroscience and your work, and references to people that I know through my own work. So it's great to trace these threads of history. So I thought I might share with you a couple of examples of work that students are doing right now, which might make all of you feel happy. Because you will see connections to your own work and the stuff that we talked about. So referring to the undergraduate program first, in the senior graduating class, students did projects on the impact of the environment on mental health, on students' attention in classrooms, on all sorts of learning experiences in classrooms. So that tradition is still very much alive. The PhD program, which is completely new, it's the first one in the SUNY system, the first program and the only program in urban and regional planning, will have 5 focal areas, and I don't remember all of them, but one of them, just I'll say, focuses on health. So because I didn't know this history, I never talked about it, but I'm going to rewrite the program brochure and now reconnect the dots to our great history. We will be one of the very few programs in the country where planners can do this work across disciplines. And I never made the connection to neuroscience, but I will add it now. We expect to admit students in the fall. It will be a very small cohort of students, so you might receive some knocks on your door asking about mentoring, so we'll be connecting the dots there. The PhD program, even though it's in planning, like Bob said, it's going to connect across the 2 departments in the school, so there'll be involvement of architects as well. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer afterwards.
Where are your students coming from?
So you are the first formal group that knows about the program. The announcement is literally waiting in the computer for Bob to send out. Even though we have not formally announced it, we have about 42 candidates from across, most of them from Western New York, but also from across the country, and we have a couple of interested people writing from Australia. And you'll be pleased that the person who's writing from Australia actually is interested in systems thinking. So it's great to hear about all of these historical precedents in our school, so all over, but mostly from Western New York.
You answered in terms of the geography you're coming from.
Oh.
I was interested in their backgrounds.
Quite a few of them are planners, but we have people who are coming from many different disciplines. So this individual from Australia, for example, has training in horticulture. And then we have some people who have training in nutrition and health sciences who are interested in the connection between planning and public health.
Just recognizing time and sequence, and we had a long evening ahead of us. We have only begun to praise this man. I do want to suggest one other kind of linear connection that goes from the reference you made to 100 research reports paid for, many of which had legs. The planning aid kit, for example, was where I first met Michael Brill while I was a program officer and an architect with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And the question was, how can I take that technology, that way of understanding making buildings, and apply it to a large institutional system that had been rubber stamping buildings for 200 years? And the question is, maybe those buildings had performative aspects related to recruitment, retention, and professional performance that could be evidence-based. So, knowing of the work of the Bureau of Standards, you had gone to SUNY when I started this work, knowing that we had more money than God because we were the Defense Department. We hired some of the best and brightest to write a series of spatialization and design guides modeled after the planning aid kit. So that's a product born here that grew out there and was one of the more innovative and new kind of institutional reforms in a program in an institution that wasn't noted for doing terrific buildings. So, and I still don't think they are, but we learned a lot from that experiment, and that program continues. We built out of that a research program at the Construction Engineering Research Laboratories in Champaign-Urbana, and started to engage people like Michael Holtz and others in that sequence, and I think that has its own history. You came back from SUNY to the AIA Research Corporation, and we did some of the early experiments in federal post-occupancy evaluation, pulling the performance of basis from that. Out of all of that research came most of my tenure. That's how I got here. So, thank you. I think I want to also draw another set of connections, which is that history of engaging the world, both as a planning aid kit, specific problem to the mental institution work in this region, then carried nationally, award-winning across the country as a progressive architecture country. There was also a lot of those reports that were about making things better right here. Your Seneca story that we'll hear tonight is one of them. We continue in that tradition, and we continue to get paid for it. And it supports the base. We have acquired a new kind of dimension of the school, partly because the faculty has said, if we want to do this research, you want this ability to spread, we need both the resources involved to do it right and the ability to reach out to broader disciplines. So we acquired the University of Buffalo's Regional Institute, a planning and economic analysis and how would you describe it, economic impact group that also had a pretty good solid base in graphic information systems and data systems modeling, 7 full-time professionals. We brought them into the school and we said, you are now part of the school's research infrastructure. You're not owned by any one researcher. You are owned by architects and planners with the intent of understanding that where architecture and planning is part of the same enterprise. And in that, we take the intellectual traditions that are quite different, as Ernie was describing, between Cornell and here and planning and architecture, and suggesting that as being part of the same enterprise, we can deliver a product that's more substantial. That group is now working with the Brookings Institute, and we're just about to contract with a large-scale systems kind of market sector and analytical firm like McKinsey Global, for example, with an idea that normally architects gets dragged along behind the findings of those institutional and market sector analytic groups. Oh, this is what we should do, therefore the environment is a result. And we have this sort of funny notion that planners and architects can be in the front end of that conversation and have a much healthier dialogue about what the product is that comes from it. That's a body of work that's driven by the governor. He's given the city of Buffalo $1 billion. He's asked us to produce a plan that shows how we can leverage it 5-to-1 before he writes the check. And our institute and our faculty are writing that plan under the sponsorship of a large 5-county council that our president and one of our local developers co-chairs. So you've got this sort of outreach and engagement, intellectually very challenging in the sense of what is the voice of architecture in that discussion, what is the voice of planning in that discussion, and how does it work across the other disciplines that engage, and where does it go from here? One layer on top of that, one of the other more exciting grants we've just got is a $2 million grant from Housing and Development for Sustainable Cities. It's an effort to take a 2-county collaboration. You know, we live on a border. You would think it would be easier for 2 counties to talk to each other than the U.S. and Canada, but I got to tell you, my Canadian consultations have been easier than this one. But we got 2 counties, and they're having a conversation. They built a framework, not a plan, for regional growth and regional development. And what we're trying to do is put the teeth and muscle through a kind of 3-year, $2 million planning school for this region that delivers the products and tools and knowledge base necessary to move forward. Again, I see all this in the spirit of those first 100 examples of how the school put itself not just in service of, but in positions of leadership for lots of inquiry across the region and then across the nation in terms of that work. With that, I want to thank you, John, again for that lovely set of reminiscences. I think the connections are clear. I want to thank all of you. When we are at commencement this evening, I'm asking all of the Eberhard era folks to come front row center, please, all the way to the front, and sit together. I will take the opportunity as part of my introduction to John to also introduce you as part of the founding core of this school. I will ask you to stand and turn to face what is a much larger graduating class than you had, and all of their parents and friends, and receive the thanks of that room, because they might. You might ask David to sit a little lower than the rest. But I think that in general, the acknowledgement is that we are obviously different and headed in a different direction and in our time, but enormously aware, and increasingly so as a function of your visit today, of the kind of thoughtfulness of our origin story. And in some ways, we are all part of our origin stories, always. So I want to thank you all for this. We're going to now break, and if you'd like, you can go kind of parade over to the Annex A. We're in temporary metal buildings, temporary as of 1960. The good news is, by the way, this construction program we talked about, Phase 1, Hayes, Phase 2, Crosby, Phase 3, tear down the annexes, restore the Great Lawn, and bring it all back. So that's part of the joy of being campus architect, is being able to shove things a little bit. So it's all tied to the architecture renovation project that we get back E.B. Green's Great Lawn. Last thing is to say to you all, because you don't have enough to read, we sent to you, I believe, both the Progressive Architecture and Michael Brill's and Amy Jamal's Attempted History in 1990. Already they were forgetting things. So those of you who lived it, give us notes and feedback on it. Let us know if it's right. We sent you this, which is a sort of snapshot of the life of the school. It's a new magazine that we'll be issuing about twice a year, and we really encourage you to take a look at that and follow our progress. And then finally, on your way out, those of you who haven't got one of these, there's a stack of these books. This is a kind of catalog of work, a journal, if you will, produced by our students that is a description of the work that was done last year in the school. Again, across both planning and architecture, you get a sense of the range, the grit, I think the social relevance, and the artistic intention, cultural intention of the architecture that we do here. So let me leave that with you, John, because I don't think you've got that one, and the rest of you can pick it up on the way out. We'll go to the accrediting room for those of you who want to see the real work of the students and touch it. It's there, and from there we'll move on. I'll see you tonight at commencement. And one more round of applause for each other.